the implications for philosophy, art, law, and politics would be considerable. Law and politics, like art and philosophy, have been obsessed with ground and origins for quite some time. The idea that people sprung from the earth itself are the original inhabitants of a country, as opposed to foreigners and strangers, and those of their descendants who kept themselves free from admixture, is perhaps as old as history itself. Consider, for instance, the oration of Panegyricus, in which Isocrates tells his fellow Athenians, "We did not became dwellers on this land by driving others out of it, nor by finding it uninhabited, nor by coming together here a motley horde composed of many races." The implication here is that the first person plural could only be properly attributed to and used by we of a lineage so noble and pure that throughout our history we have continued in possession of the very land in which gave us birth, since we are sprung from its very soil and are able to address our city by the very names which we apply to our nearest kin. That was Isocrates. Because the land endures, as well as our connection with it, there is a we together. The difference between this, the classical approach to origins, appeals to soil and origin, and its difference with modern racial thinking is that only in the latter, the legitimacy of a people to rule over a territory presupposes the absence of other peoples from that territory. The latter must either assimilate or be gone. Alternatively, their bodies and a specific genealogy must be erased from the face of the earth so as to purify the legitimacy claim of a ruling people. Such purified or grounded legitimacy as a people could thus be projected over the entire earth as the very measure or norm for apportioning terrestrial space. The ground of legitimacy is no longer being of the space, but rather being in this or that space unimpeded by others. The ground of legitimacy becomes then the obliteration of all others who appear or may appear as an obstacle in the horizon of our supposedly unending march forward. This is to say that we must add a third to the two well-known conceptions of democracy and rights that begin with the sovereignty of a demos, the people as mass, over a topos, a place. The latter, and better known, are: first, democracy as a decision procedure, generally a majority rule, and rights as the rights of such majority. According to this theory, democratic practice, its institutions as well as democratic rights or freedoms, are the result of a variety of methods that aggregate interests. If they could replicate the ideal results of iterative or repeated bargaining, such methods could eventually justify allowing a majority, or perhaps a coalition of minorities, to rule regardless of the sequence of arrivals, invasions, conquests, departures, repressions and removals that constituted the body politic. Examples of such aggregative theories of democratic institutions and freedoms can be found in early modern contractual theory, Thomas Hobbes, for instance, classical liberalism, and contemporary rational choice theory. Second, deliberative democracy, which views democratic institutions as engaged in a truth procedure, similar to a scientific method in which individual minds gather in a public sphere for a dialogue among equals aimed towards rational persuasion. In this conception, also known as constructivist, we might as well consider ourselves as minorities for the purposes of deliberation. The practical question is how to reach finality in deliberation while valuing the deliberative process for its own sake. Rights, in this conception, are the result of such deliberation, or in Habermas's well-known Rawlsian formulation, an overlapping consensus. These are both, as you know very well, also forms of human and constitutional rights adjudication. The third one is the view that places the addition or subtraction of bodies to the demos, not just truths or the finality of interest, at the center of the operation of democratic institutions and the functioning of rights. We tend to forget that law not only establishes the boundary between the legal and the illegal, as well as policing the limits between order and disorder. Law also declares what and who counts as orderable or unorderable. It not only places the rules for dialogue, but also prescribes who can take part in the conversation. But otherwise, it says who counts as one of us. But this operation, adding and subtracting, depends on the postulation of the not one of us as zero, non-being, impurity, or inexistence. This is an act of original displacement, of one occupying the place of another, or damnation, as Frantz Fanon put it. For him, and I agree with him, this act defines colonialism beyond any Hegelian or post-Hegelian master-slave dialectic or a struggle for recognition. You can call this zero the victim, vis-a-vis a beneficiary, who might or might not be the same as the perpetrator. In a time and translocal sequence, this can include the successors of the perpetrators, and in a parallel but different sequence, the successors of the victims. These two groups might share the same space, but in fact, they may just as well belong to different planets. They are mutually exterior occupants of the same ground, and thus, what characterizes their situation is their prior lack of relation. This is how Fanon sees the situation of native and settler. According to Fanon, this is the root of genocide. The foremost example of the genocidal logic of colonialism is the concept of the vanishing Indian, which you can find in US law and history, as well as in Simón Bolívar's letter from Jamaica, addressed to a British audience, pretty much every constitution in the Americas. Also in the restoration of slavery by Napoleon during the French Revolution. Notice that if we define revolutionary struggle as the confrontation between victims and beneficiaries, it is the case that in concrete instances, concrete revolutionary demands of victims and beneficiaries can be made from the standpoint of either native or settler. And the demands of settlers and natives can be enunciated from the standpoint of either victim or beneficiary. This means that race, colonial, and class paradigms should be seen as two dials on the same ideological clock, moving at different historical speeds, sometimes occluding each other, sometimes not. When a violent event occurs to reset the historical clock, these four axes, native, settler, victim, beneficiary, overlap. In such occasions, the truth can be told from this event according to the temporality of either colonial and class struggle, as though these separate narratives were functionally one and the same. Crucially, the settlers' question is always, how can we live among these savages without civilizing them? Which means that for the colonial modern project of democracy and human rights to get underway, living without the savages is always a solution, the final solution. Conversely, to live free from the will of the master settler is always, for the native victim, the imaginable outcome of a decolonizing struggle. This is a dream, however, one that cannot remain as yet to come. Therefore, this has nothing to do with transitional justice, which always assumes that the beneficiaries of past injustice always have some time left, and that we must patiently wait for justice to be realized, for it takes time, but never place. I shall speak instead of remedial justice, in the sense of a new moral image of the world that is also an indictment of this world, a form of final judgment or revolutionary urgency. Let me also say right away that for me it wouldn't make much sense to ask or speak of the human rights of the victim native, for she is by definition, from the settler's perspective, equal to zero. Therefore, I shall speak of post-human rights in the sense of the possibility of attributing the right to have rights on the side of the objects. Things, or the debris left by history as a piling of catastrophes upon catastrophes. I am simply inviting you to shift your standpoint. For the native victim, history is both catastrophe and the urgency of a struggle. At the level of cosmic dreams or imagination, rather than mere conceptual aggregation or recent conceptualization. It is more a matter of mutual enlightenment, if you like, that you may have to force the other or yourself to see. This is the perspective of what takes place here and now, and it is therefore located. For the settler beneficiary, history is about avoiding catastrophe and making sure the end of days never comes, so that history continues in transition rather than taking place. This entails taking the perspective of the metropole towards the local. I believe human rights are metropolitan rather than cosmopolitan. I also believe this perspective is mistaken, or rather, the result of an optical illusion. My modest aim today is to dispel that illusion in philosophy and law. In my book, A Story of a Death Foretold, on the events of 11 September 1973, the metropolitan view is assumed by two of the main characters in the unfolding tragedy. First, by the self-titled owners of Chile, the landowners and banking families ruling the country since its putative independence from European colonialism. And second, by Henry Kissinger, speaking on behalf of the US Nixon administration. The former, the owners of Chile, asserted their claim to legitimacy and thus to sovereign power and exclusive legislative capacity in fairly uncompromising terms. Let me quote one of them. The sole owners of Chile are ourselves, the owners of capital and the soil. This is what one of them, banker Eduardo Matre, said in 1892. Notice that by the time this assertion is made, late 19th century, the older notion of autochthony has been revised to include ownership. The ground is not so much to come from the earth, though the concept of a collective identity and self-constitution as heritage and futurehood, the ability to project one's heritage into the future, is still crucial. Rather, it is ownership of soil and capital, and having the capacity to project ownership and capital into the future as return or profit. That is what grounds sovereignty and legitimacy. From such a perspective, to undermine ownership and the accumulation of capital is an attack against our sovereignty, legitimacy, and identity. Taking measures through legal means or otherwise to limit or transform property ownership is construed from such a perspective as an existential threat, aiming to strike at the heart of the laws of nature and the original order. From this standpoint, whoever personifies such a threat to undermine ownership of the soil and capital can only be conceived of and presented as the Antichrist or evil incarnate. It is therefore not only right but a sacred duty, in accordance to certain readings of religious orthodoxy, popular among young conservative elites in the Americas in the 1970s, inspired by the rise of fascism in Europe, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, where World War II was never won. To exorcise and extirpate such evil from the spirit of society by any means necessary. To the latter, Kissinger and the US Nixon administration of the 1970s, this article of faith could be and had been translated into the normative terms of a secular and global philosophy of history, according to which here I'm quoting Henry Kissinger, history has never happened and will never happen in the South. My argument in the book is that these two different but related standpoints coincided in the anxious context of the Americas in the 1970s and converged into a master rule, a metropolitan law of globalization, with catastrophic effects for those attempting to change the tide in Chile, the global South, and the world over. We live in the shadow of such metropolitan law of globalization. My work so far can be interpreted as a critique of that perspective. I have argued that the metropolitan law of globalization is the result of the translation of old philosophical, aesthetic, and political obsessions with ground and origins into the secular language of global capitalism and cosmopolitan history. Because of this, it is perhaps best to understand this effort as, first of all, an attempt to tease out the consequences of philosophy, law, and art's abandonment of such obsessions, ground, autochthony, and futurehood. Second, I am interested in the question, what do we write history for? In the sense not only of global secular or cosmopolitan history, but of universal or redemptive history as well. By implication, I focus on the nature of what can be called the judgment of history, in the post-secular sense of the term. This is the kind of judgment that brings about remedial, not only redistributive justice. Remedial justice is the kind of political act that brings closure to a repetitive cycle of catastrophes. Finally, I hope it will become apparent to you by the end of this session, how is it that the answer to the two previous questions, free fall as our existential situation on the one hand, and the judgment of history on the other, depend upon us shifting our current visual as well as narrative standpoint. Notice that at stake is not just cognition or epistemology, but moreover, imagination and ethics, which is to say, our ability to come up with and project a strange or unfamiliar world image, and allow